Welcome, welcome. We'll give everyone a quick moment to join us and enter the room before we begin. This is where I would play my Spider-Man 2099 theme music, but apparently it's not registering through my computer microphone. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jared Coseglia. I am the CEO and founder of True Staffing Partners. For those of you who know us, we specialize in e-discovery, data privacy, cybersecurity, and other tertiary disciplines, all of which we will touch upon today, like governance, like AI, like legal operations, and much more. We are a Inc. 5000 fastest growing company 4 of the last 7 years. And I personally place close to 5,000 people in full-time or contract to hire or fractional jobs over the last 25 years. I love this community. We wanted to have a lot of fun today by giving a little bit of a Spider-Verse theme, but the topics we're going to cover are not so funny. They're kind of amazing. I want to introduce, if we could go back one slide, Mary Taylor, I want to introduce someone who is not only, in my mind, one of the smartest people in the room, in any room that he walks into. And I've heard that people who are the smartest people in the room hate to be called that, but I'm going to do it anyway, because he is rare in that regard. He's also the first person, when I first got into this business, that I ever, as a talent agent, got a job offer for. Now, he didn't take that job, by the way. He took a different job, but it was probably one of the best decisions that he ever made. And now he's in a completely different and reinvented role. And I am so honored, delighted, and excited to introduce many of you who don't know him, but also to spend some time with him and expose his brilliance to all of you. Please help me in welcoming Robert Wickstrom to our webinar. Robert, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. And to be fair, Jared, and to give credit where credit is due, you counseled me in that session where I was hired out of your office by a competing company because it was a better opportunity for me. A little bit that demonstrates who you are as a character.
I appreciate that, and that is accurate. That is accurate. Well, I've always wanted what is best for you, and I always want what's best for the people that we represent and the companies we represent. And I think what's best for the community is for them to learn from you, because you had this incredible journey over the last 20 plus years. I've been really honored to be a passenger on that journey with you. And let's start, before we dive into the agenda here, Robert, I'd love for everybody to just hear what was that first job in e-discovery. Tell us a little bit about what that first job is, and then we'll talk a little bit about what your job is today before we fill in the gaps between.
Wow. My first job in e-discovery was back in, I guess, 1995, 1996 at a law firm in Seattle called Perkins Coie. At that time, they were doing the Boeing McDonnell Douglas merger. And there was quite a bit of angst with the European Union at that time about that merger. And so I fell into that role because I had just graduated music school and didn't have a job. And somebody's like, "You're really good with technology and stuff. Why don't you go temp?" And that's how my career started.
And what were some of the basic job responsibilities for that job? Quick bullet points.
Scanning. I did late night support for the senior partner on all the conversations with The Hague and the EU. I did review management. I set up PCs and desks, learned how to use CD-ROMs when they were still gold particles, things like that. Anything they needed someplace to fill in, and they hired me as a paralegal out of that role.
And flash forward nearly 2 decades and tell us where you're working now, what the job is, and what some of the responsibilities that you hold today are.
So I am working in an international bank in Denmark. It's the largest bank in Denmark. and I have probably the coolest gig in the world. My job is to help the business and other parts of technology organization understand what are the risks associated with the decisions in how they're designing, managing, and maintaining different aspects of information control and things like that.
So you'll notice he didn't say the word e-discovery anywhere in his description of his second job, which just shows you the multiverses that Robert has hopped into. And for those of you that are fans of Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse, and Across the Spider-Verse, you're going to hear me making all sorts of Easter egg kind of comments. I tried to get Robert to really dive in and appreciate it the way my children and I did, but I don't know if it will be, some of it will be lost on him, but that's okay. Let's go to our agenda and talk a little bit about what we're here today to talk about. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, but we're going to go much deeper into what these multiverses are, focusing on skills e-discovery people have, and not just the subject matter expertise that they might bring, and differentiating those two, shifting your mindset, not your skill set. I think we spend a lot of time hearing people talk about additional training and education, learning things they don't already know, but we're hoping here today to kind of unpack the things you already do know and the mindset of how to apply those in different ways, and then giving some tactical advice about how to jump into some career multiverses. Robert, before we get into the nuts and bolts, what do you want people to gain from today's webinar so they can kind of look forward a half an hour, 45 minutes from now and think, this is what Robert hopes that we can digest over the time we spend together today?
So I've given this quite a bit of thought, and at the end of this present or conversation, what I hope to convey is that with a little bit of courage and enthusiasm and using the skills that you already possess, that you would entertain at a minimum looking at cybersecurity, looking at compliance, looking at information management, looking at governance, risk, and compliance. These more corporate roles. And in this, the hope is that we can leverage the talent, this wealth of talent that we have that truly understands the difference between people and process and how they work with information. And more importantly, what's the difference between information and data? And taking that and getting them into a position in the organization, which we'll talk about, which is where they're proactively thinking about solving problems before they occur, rather than coming in like they're trained to solve problems and do root cause analysis when something has gone wrong. So having courage to bring that talent to the regulated corporations around the world for their compliance and information governance.
And you know, Robert, one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this with you is because you've done one of the things that many e-discovery professionals who come to us at True Staffing Partners yearn for, which is successfully find a place in an in-house corporate department where you can add value and continue to grow your career in a way that is tertiary, tangential, and extension of all the e-discovery experience that you've had. And Robert's worked at some of the biggest law firms, service providers in the e-discovery space: Concilio, Sullivan Cromwell, Strzok Levan. I mean, he's worked at some real amazing cachet logos, and now at the biggest bank in Denmark. For me, Robert, I really want people to have a window into how to solve two big career challenges that people face that they come to us with on a daily basis. The first is, how do I get into a corporation? How do I break into a corporation? And the challenge we have often with e-discovery professionals is that there are not a lot of e-discovery jobs at in-house corporations. The way that the community in the industry has evolved is about 90 to 95% of the actual employment that occurs in our industry in exclusively e-discovery is in law firms and vendors, not in corporations. So to achieve that desire and goal, like you have to move into corporate, may require some reinvention, may require jumping into a multiverse and leveraging those canon events that made you who you are as an e-discovery professional into a slightly different modality in-house at corporate. The second issue that this also addresses and solves is people want vertical and financial mobility. And e-discovery is becoming an increasingly top-heavy industry with very little farming happening at the entry level. And as a result, there is continued, especially in this economy, downward pressure from employers to find less expensive talent, especially after we just got through 21 and 22, which were the busiest years of e-discovery hiring that I've ever seen in the 25 years that I've been doing this. We think about 2/3 of the industry changed jobs since the pandemic. And that movement accelerated salaries anywhere from 22 to 40% for most mid-market professionals. And now people are asking themselves, what happens next in terms of my vertical and financial mobility? And moving into a multiverse may be the only, if not one of, the solutions to solving that ambition. So let's dive right in to what the multiverses are. Go ahead,
let's
Robert.
break that down. When I was doing e-discovery, there's multiple reasons that my path went, and we won't go into those this evening, but I always sat there and asked myself, is e-discovery really still going to exist in 10 years? Man, we're almost solved all these problems. We're already processing terabyte of data a day. You know, we can search across, 3 million records in less than a second. So what do we have to solve here? But we all recognize that communication channels, the type of technologies used for people to work and collaborate, it's changing. The type of data is changing. Technology is changing. All of these things will continue to change. E-discovery is not going away. Where I believe that there's a benefit both for corporate organizations, particularly publicly traded companies, but also for e-discovery professionals, is that regulators are putting more and more requirements on corporations to manage their technology, manage their cybersecurity, and manage their information governance. And they are getting less and less patient with corporations raising their hands in the air saying, yep, we're doing that. And so, for instance, we're seeing regulations in Europe now where they're actually going to start requiring corporations to demonstrate this. And that opens the door for this body of professionals to bring that talent from a post-incident investigative mindset into how do you design good process in an organization so that we know who touched what file. We know whether or not they read it on such and such a date, right? Or we make sure that we're not keeping 20 copies of a file. And then finally, you mentioned just the hiring and so forth around this. I was reading an article about one of Elon Musk's former wives. I don't know how many he's had, but anyway, they referenced her as a former wife. And she mentioned one of the things about becoming a billionaire was, in addition to just having a tough skin, and I'm paraphrasing her, and I apologize if she's listening, which would be cool, but she also said you need to be lucky. So there is a little bit of being prepared with a tough skin and having luck to find that opportunity, back to your first point, of how did I wind up in such a cool gig, right? And what we're going to talk about and unpack a little bit today is just what are some of those aspects of your career. How do you think about them different? What is the method by which you do maybe a little bit of research and preparation, working with companies like yourself to find those opportunities, and when you get that opportunity, what you need to do in order to be successful to get the second conversation?
100%. Let's take a look at what some of those multiverses might look like. Here are kind of the top 10 that we were able to siphon out. Most of them you'll see are swimming upstream like a salmon from e-discovery, but they are diverse and they are very different. Robert, tell us about which of these your job currently touches on and to what extent.
All of them, number 10, the least. And if people know me, they're probably a little surprised by that. But all of these in some capacity are a part of my daily life. But again, I'm in a very unique position in that I'm doing technology risk. So these are all things that I help the organization understand just how is it impacting them, what are good decisions, And are we actually asking the right questions in advance?
And from where we're sitting here at True, the one that we've seen the most volume of people swim upstream to are number 1 in governance, number 6 in privacy, number 8 in compliance, and starting to see more in number 4 and 5, although the amount of jobs available in the marketplace in 4 or 5 somewhat pale in comparison to the amount of jobs available in 1, 6, and 8. So just to give you a sense of what's out there and available from a job volume perspective, that's what we're seeing. And look, a lot of this is the result, as Robert probably knows, of the pandemic, and the pandemic really changing the way legal departments and technology departments inside corporations were viewing and valuing certain role responsibilities. I think if you had asked everybody in 2019 and early 2020 what the next big thing was, they would have all told you legal ops and are you going to clock this month? But what we've seen is the amount of jobs that dissipated in legal ops and the pay for those jobs decreased significantly during the pandemic. What then increased are jobs around risk, jobs around privacy, jobs around governance, because you can't really get into jobs 9 and 10 until you really address what you're doing in 1, 6, 7, 8, 3, 4, and 5. Right? These jobs become ancillary to having the first 8 somewhat established or at least addressed in your organization.
I just have to say, Jared, can I say bingo?
Yes. And with that said, let's move forward.
So, but let me blow your mind and our listeners' minds. Assuming assumption. Can I just go back to that previous slide, MT? Assuming that our audience is largely e-discovery professionals or have some affiliation with e-discovery, past or present. If I told them that you do risk every day and that you do controls every day, and those 2 words will open the door for any opportunity in an organization that's traded, because that's how they operate. We just use a different vocabulary and different concepts, but we are really good in e-discovery at risk and at controls. Risk, what do we call that? Every time that you go in and you figure out we're going to process and we're going to finish production or collections on time, make all of these things that you do, that's all weighing risk with the partners and the associates. Controls, every time we do QC and put a process, what's our QC process? Those are controls. We're really good at those things. And that is in any part of the organization, if it's publicly traded, they have an enterprise risk management program, and people need to do those things. They're already ready. Number
and
one.
They're not static, right?
Exactly. Well, what I wanted to do was say all of these things, these are all really fancy buzzwords up here. But the fundamental skill is you do risk and controls really well. You understand information. Legal operations, all right, remove legal and just call it operations. It's the same thing, it's just a different client. Same thing with legal project manager. Remove legal, call it project manager. It's the same thing. They use different vocabulary often, not always, but often. But it's the same, exact same professional concept and application.
And it speaks to something we talked about a lot when we were preparing for this webinar, which are what are those value propositions and skill sets that e-discovery people have? And I think one of them that you identified was they learn new things quickly and they're able to change and adapt very quickly. So let's talk about a few of these things. Obviously, learning new things quickly is necessary, right? Laws change. I remember when Federal Rules of Civil Procedure came out the first time, and then the updates, 5-6 years later, everybody was changing the way that they ran their reviews and the way that they ran their discovery collections processes. And that created all sorts of opportunity for people to come in and show added value because they had learned those things very quickly. The same is very true of privacy or security. New regulations coming out all the time in privacy, a very fractured US privacy law landscape, regulatory landscape. What are some of the other things, MT? Let's take a look at number 2. Robert, you want to unpack this and how it relates to both e-discovery and potentially to some of these jobs in the multiverse?
So one of the differences in corporations is essentially the time frame that we accomplish requirements. Often in the e-discovery world, these are very fast-moving projects, very large budgets, high-demand customers. But you need to design process, put controls around it, quality controls, QC, and meet a deadline. It's the same thing in a corporation, expanded timeframes, but you have that natural ability, and you've been trained in your career to meet deadlines. Put a project plan together, put quality control around it, be able to report on it, and meet the deadline. And that's number two, really be able to do that.
Robert, real quick, before we go into number three, was it an adjustment for you to, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but have to have more patience with the pace at which deadlines are set and projects are expected to be delivered, as opposed to the very pressure cooker environment that e-discovery professionals are often accustomed to and maybe addicted to?
Yeah, it was, and it's something that I have to work on. Part of it's just my personality. I like to move fast, and I like to fail quickly. That's just my personality. But in a corporation, you're right, things change different. For instance, in IT, traditionally we estimate 7-year life cycle on a piece of infrastructure, right? That's a large investment, a lot of work to manage, design, manage, and maintain that. I have, one of the things that I was privileged to have over here by the bank was they got me an executive coach, Sina Guerin, who will hopefully talk a little bit about her research later on, but she really helped me challenge myself, break out of those tendencies and those habits that you use to help you get this successful in leadership, and take a step back and evaluate. And so you really need to work on that, and having a coach to help you with that is very helpful.
Tell us about where data lives and why that's so important, and why e-discovery professionals are uniquely positioned to add value, knowing on where to find data.
I think one of the biggest eye openers for me in this in this role that I have now, and speaking to my colleagues around Europe and different organizations, is the disconnect between the information, the data, and the technology. And let me unpack that a little bit. Technology exists only to allow us to process, store, or transfer zeros and ones, data, right? It's when we then package that data up and we do something with it, it becomes information, whether it's a document on a file share or a PDF that we print out. It's just information. And so where data lives, how it came into existence, and more importantly, what is a reasonable life, and should I say proliferation of that file, is something that e-discovery people just are naturally aware of via the nature of the investigations they've done.
It's funny because I remember when spoliation and defensively deleting data were the biggest problems that e-discovery professionals were grappling with. This is, a decade or more ago, maybe more, maybe 2 decades ago. And we've really, I don't want to say overcome that, but it's kind of become rote and an expectation, not an innovation, in terms of what we're adding in terms of value as e-discovery professionals. Help us understand the difference of how data is created versus where data lives, because this is something that is rapidly changing in our social media, general human existence as a species, how we're creating data, and why e-discovery professionals are so adept at knowing how to address that for a corporation.
Yeah, one of my main research areas right now is into something called hyper-converged infrastructure. So in other words, taking the old data center where you drove up in a car, you walked through a revolving door, you went through a man trap, and you went through 7 layers of biometric security to get in, throw it out the door, right? That all belongs to AWS and Microsoft and Google, and they all have these big data centers, or we call them cloud in an organization. In the old days, you would have a server and you would put some web and database and things on there, and we knew where the data was. It was on that server. Today, when we spin something up, the way that the elasticity of the technology works, it's just entirely different. So being able to understand where the storage is versus where the actual applications and processes are happening is all done now in what we call YAML files of code. And the challenge here is for the future is for people, we need people who understand the flow of data as it coincides with the process and the people. As we all know from the investigations, generally the smoking gun will come down to where senior management thought something was happening in IT and it really wasn't happening, even though it was written in policy.
I want to drill down into that because we talked about this a lot on our prep, but specifically what we're calling utilized at the human level. And I remember what you said to me, which has stayed with me since you said it, which is, at a certain point, bad actors knew not to put something in an email, but they might be more likely to put it in Slack, or they might be more likely to put it in a Salesforce note, or they might give themselves as a human permission to say certain things in certain venues and communicate certain things in certain ways that they wouldn't in an email or they wouldn't in a text message. Help us understand why e-discovery people are so valuable, because they understand that human dynamic of how communication data is created as it relates to not just smoking guns, but potential privacy violations or sharing of PII or password exchange that could lead to security breach protocol issues. Unpack that, because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, so when an e-discovery person, from my experience, and I'm obviously generalizing to a high level here, but an e-discovery person, if you came to them and you say, listen, this is the business, here are the people, the custodians, here are the cast of characters in this particular matter. This is what they were creating, right? Their delivery, their product, and this is how they were doing it, and here's the data we collected. When an e-discovery person hears that and then looks at the data, they're going to go, something's missing. And they'll use a variety of tools, but a lot of it is just that being able to look at the patterns in the data and how that coincides and how they write documents or create documents. And they're able to look at it and go, no, that was actually created by hand. It looks like somebody scanned it and then they did this and that. So they're able to unpack things about data and correlate that to people and process and be able to just do a smell test on it. Is that really what's happening here?
My staff said to me the other day, we know when Jared is typing versus when he's using voice automation to send a message, because there'll be typos more often than not, in what he's typing, but then there'll actually be autocorrects when he uses his voice, and we can actually distinguish the difference based on his communication styles of when he's voice dictating versus when he's actually sitting down at the keyboard, based on spelling errors or autocorrect errors. And I just found that fascinating. I think that speaks to this, right? Discovery professionals know how data is used and communicated in different ways.
Your staff has just demonstrated a very rudimentary, and love them, I'm sure, I haven't met them, but a very rudimentary example of data analytics. By understanding who you are, they've been trained on models, your data, right, sample sets. They have been able to identify certain patterns based upon their education and what's good grammar and what's not, right? So all of these things, they've been given the rules. And they can now look at an output of information and say, it was created this way or it was created this way. When I was in Columbia University, one of my classmates had an interesting role with the Army, and he was going around one of the theaters of war and had a team, and they were trying to sniff out where the bad guys were. And one of the ways they did that was with cell phone triangulating cell phone activity. Well, what they realized was the bad guys sort of figured this out and they turned their cell phones off. So bad guys thought they were being really smart. But what actually happened was all the American Army had to do was look at where the black spots with cell activity, and that's where all the senior bad guys are. So it's the same thing with data analytics. We don't know, but this whole concept of how we will be able to use data, corporations need experience to help keep themselves out of trouble. Because as we all know in e-discovery, one of the great things about humans is they will find a way around a rule if it makes their job easier. Same thing for data analytics.
MT, let's pop up number 5. Defending things beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that speaks for itself, but Robert, help us understand why that is so valuable as an ESI pro, potentially moving into a multiverse.
With your experience, I would anticipate folks would be looking for roles where they can impart and be influential. So you want to be providing information in some capacity, because senior stakeholders are going to be using that to make decisions and represent activities in the organization. As such, you need to make sure that you're giving them information that if they were ever challenged by a regulator, by a corporate authority, or by a legal process, that the information you gave them was repeatable, defensible, and that you could point to factual information in order to say, yes, beyond a reasonable doubt, we're confident this information was correct, right? And in e-discovery, that's a natural thing. That's what our whole process was about, or is about, is that being able to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that supported by the metadata, the content, and interviews of the stakeholders, that it all aligns up, and the attorneys can weave a fact case around it.
And we know this because so many of us are in law firms and vendors, but it also leads to revenue generation. And even in corporations, particularly in the areas of privacy and security, some of these decisions may be used by sales teams in building products, rolling out services to different organizations. And if it's not repeatable, or they don't know that this is something that can be scaled, right? Often in e-discovery, we're descaling, but in corporate America, we're often upscaling. It becomes a challenge to grow a business. And the best way to have influence in corporate, I would imagine, would be to reduce risk and increase revenue. Yeah.
Manage your risk. We want to reduce it, but we want to manage it. Here is where I would offer that an e-discovery person, yes, we try to reduce the requirement to have to scale. But all of the process that e-discovery people put together is designed to scale, because attorneys are expensive, processing time, storage, it's all really, really expensive. So by nature, e-discovery people think about scale, defensible scale, in other words, repeatable scale. So I would offer that the whole concept and what they bring is that if you're going to help an organization spend €1 million building out a new program around security, having somebody who can come in and provide insight that is not only scalable, but it's defensible. And to your point, you can take that information and go to your sales team and say, listen, this is why we are a competitive advantage, because our security process is defensive, repeatable, and defendable, right? You're exactly right.
So let's move on to talk about how we take these unique skill sets and shift our mindset without having to learn a whole new set of skills and still leverage ourselves into a multiverse opportunity. So what we're talking about now is reframing the skills that you have in a way that can be leveraged differently. So Robert, I think this one is maybe the most obvious, but also maybe the most compelling in shifting viewing data from past tense to future tense. Help us understand what you mean by that.
Yeah. In e-discovery and investigations, we are looking at incidents that have already occurred. What we are in my world today, we would say, what was the phishing control, right? What process broke that allowed that person to do that bad thing, or a good person having a bad day and messed up. So what I mean by this is we're really good at looking at the data and the process and the information in front of us and being able to say, when we put all of this together, why didn't they just take this data, put it in its own folder, or maybe add a different authentication for this particular one, or a different information classification, or what it might be. But having that ability to take the experience from all the investigations, and then as you're designing, how do we, for instance, make GDPR less expensive? In other words, instead of having to go out and collect an entire network share or an entire OneDrive for a group, we know, because we tagged data in this way, that beyond a reasonable doubt, we only need to grab these metadata tags. And these are the type of things where I'm talking about shifting from the past into thinking about what if and what can.
So for those of you that are Spider-Verse fans, this is where we take a canon event and say, hey, this canon event has to be the same in every single Spider-Verse, or else Spider-Man won't survive. Well, how do we think about maybe altering canon events to create better outcomes, not the same outcome? I think this is a really important one for people to think. It's a subtle shift in thinking your mindset, but I think e-discovery people, particularly on interviews, find themselves talking about histrionics as opposed to the application of those histrionics to a future tense. Next up, we have shifting from subpoena to suggestion, or as I believe Robert said, enforcing to influencing. Tell us what you mean here, Robert.
Yeah, in e-discovery, we're very familiar with the idea. We write interrogatories, we do data requests, we do interviews. And once we identify what the potential information is, we need it. And we go collect it all. And it's expensive, and it's very disruptive to the organization. That's that subpoena mindset. I need this. Give it to me, right? We're trying to defend you, so just give it to me. Doesn't matter that you have 5 programs ongoing that the regulators say you need to get done. This thing is the most important because it can affect shareholder value today. So that's the demanding. The influencing part here is taking that same concept, and now, and this is hard, it's not easy, you need to look at those things, those types of information, and you come over to this part of a collaborative exercise with your colleagues, maybe cross-departmental, and now you are influencing on decision-making with stakeholders. It's no longer that single partner that's saying, I need this. Now you are influencing multiple partners on what decisions need to be made. And you're doing that through their proxies, generally their lower level managers.
Robert, would you say that when you step out of e-discovery and into these other potential multiverse job opportunities, that there's a possibly greater appetite to take risks when it relates to positive future outcomes for the business in areas of governance, in areas of security, in areas of privacy versus e-discovery?
100%. I think that, I've been in my current role, and I've had 2 conversations in the entire time on e-discovery. A little mind-boggling. But what I did was I said, okay, not part of that conversation. That's okay. What can I influence down here to help reduce those downstream costs that I know any traded organization in the financial sector has to deal with? You're going to get sued. Your regulators are going to demand stuff. It costs money. But in my role, how can I influence that? So as you think about what could I do in this particular area, it's really about working on some soft skills on, you have a really great idea. You know what's going to happen because you've seen it in 15 cases. You don't have to guess. If you don't do that identity access management change, you are going to pay a lot of money. It's not a question. We know that. But how do you influence that? And this comes down to soft skills. I really recommend doing master's degrees or some type of program to go in and understand how to creatively express yourself using formal processes of program management and project management and the other things you learn in business school. And those skills come in effect here. And how do you influence? And it is hard.
Let's keep moving. Shifting from investigating to creating value. What do we mean here, Robert?
So in the investigation phase, we challenge, we question, we always, a little bit like a police officer, assume that something bad is happening. You need to demonstrate that it's not happening. Take a step back from that investigative, that police action, right? Coming in after the fact as the detective, ripping everything apart and figuring out exactly where did it go wrong. Coming in, we need to create value now. And how do we have a conversation with our colleagues? How do we leverage that experience? We know what's going to go wrong. There's only 15 controls we really need to focus on here, right? So the influencing and the creating value here is just taking those ideas, taking a deep breath, and practicing having a conversation about that. And you can do this by going out and having meals with IT people, even in e-discovery companies. Go speak to your back office IT team. It's the same thing.
I also think of it as, we're going to talk about vocabulary in a second, shifting from I need to know to I'd like to help. And there's a difference, right? It's subtle, but that approach changes the way you're able to influence people, right? As soon as you're in a I need to know, right, the subpoena versus the I'd like to help, you're going to get a different kind of resistance or acceptance from the person that you're posing that question to.
And if I could leave this session with one tagline, that would be it, Jared. I think you sum things up really, really nicely. You're bringing a wealth of experience, particularly around information, people, process, data. And that experience in the organization, they often haven't thought that way. So keeping in the back of your mind that I want to help, I think you summed this conversation up nicely.
So I'll take this last one. So we will keep moving forward. I like this last one because I always think e-discovery often is looking for the smoking gun, right? I remember 10 years ago, George Stosha saying, well, at the end of the day, we're just looking for that smoking gun. And when we move into these multiverses, we're not just looking for a smoking gun, we're looking for what that through line is in potential future outcomes. And I think instead of looking for a needle, we're threading that needle, right? So we can't just find it and say, I got it. We say, okay, how does this actually stitch things together, creating a more harmonious patchwork between all sorts of organizations in a potentially perpetual manner, right? Whereas once we find the needle, we can kind of dead stop and say, well, I gotcha, or we don't gotcha. We're going to need to figure out a way to make a case. And I think that it's less about making a case and more about perpetuating possibilities. Right?
Exactly. Again, I want to help bringing that experience. So instead of finding the smoking gun, that one thing that you're going to fixate on, no. It's the 80-20 rule. It's risk. Identifying where there is a hiccup in the pattern of process, people, data, technology. Being able to point, when they transition from that step to that step in their process, they're going from Exchange into Adobe. When that happens, this could happen. Maybe if we did this, add this additional compensating control here, and now what you've done is provided the team the conversation and talking points to prevent the smoking gun, right? And then the rest of it is the risk. The organization needs to determine, are we happy with the risk of 20%?
And we've tried to use these in very concise little catchy phrases because finding ways to articulate your transition into a multiverse requires sound bites so that people can digest them, right? Bites are digestible. So as we move forward into how does this actually translate into jumping to different jobs, your resume, your interview, your follow-up, let's just unpack some of that quickly. Rethinking your approach to your job search, seeking companies, not jobs, and communities and culture, not necessarily vertical and financial mobility. Help us understand what we mean here, Robert.
It starts with being able to articulate what it is you're looking for. And that's difficult. And a way to back into that is be able to articulate what you're fatigued with and understand what's important to you with those. And from there, start asking yourself between data, technology, and people, compliance, legal, cyber, all of these cool things, what interests me? Where do I want to get stronger, better? And from there, start interviewing or looking for companies that hold those similar traits where you want to get stronger, and make sure they have the right culture for you. You're interviewing the company as much as they're interviewing you.
And let's talk about how that rethinks on an actual interview. We talked a lot about vocabulary, vernacular. Help us understand what that means and why the right choices of words, right? Controls isn't necessarily a word we hear in e-discovery a lot. QC is a word we hear all the time. Sometimes they could be interchangeable. Sometimes they're very different. Why is it important to start to adapt and adopt a new vernacular based on the multiverse you want to jump into?
This is where I was going to talk a little bit about my coach, Sina Bjerring. And so she works with Danish companies. Her research is in working with Danish companies to help how to assimilate foreign leadership into Danish companies. But she also works with the Danish companies on how do you, with the foreign leaders on what is it you need to do to adapt. So when it comes to this part of it here, the vocabulary is super important. So we've already talked about move from thinking past tense to future tense, and move from demanding to helping, right? And this particular here, just like we do at the beginning of a case, we're listening for how the company, what vocabulary they use. What do they call their system? What do they call PDS when they create it? What is that vocabulary they're using? It's the same concept when you're going to shift the vertical or adjust your vertical, I would say. And in this, it took me about 14 months, and all of a sudden the light switched when I realized that, okay, I actually knew this stuff. They just use a different vocabulary and they compartmentalize the different functions different ways. Once I figured that out, I was comfortable. So if I would have paid a little more attention to that sooner, that would have helped.
And when you were interviewing for the role that you're in now, did you find that they were looking for right and wrong answers or abilities to use specific sets of technology, or are they more interested in seeing the way that you think and might problem solve?
I think it was fairly consistent with a lot of us, and there's many people on the call who are hiring managers. There were things on my resume. They wanted to hear that I actually had a CISSP, right? That I actually did understand forensics, or that I actually did understand risk. Now, I might have had to talk around it a little bit because, I didn't use their vocabulary, but in the interview, I was listening and I adjusted. After the interview, I spoke to people, captured information. In my thank you letter, I responded using the vocabulary. But overall, what were they listening? They were listening for, I think, what we all listen for is coherent, competent, professional, and articulate command of the subject that I was interviewing for.
What I found in e-discovery that's fascinating, and I think those of us who are in the industry that are on this call have experienced this maybe tenfold over the last few years, is as technology companies, specifically software ones, have consolidated, right? And Reveal just bought iPro and Logical. Before that, they bought a number of others. Relativity's been buying up companies right and left for years. This consolidation of technology has to some extent led hiring managers to drive interview processes with, do you know this? Can I plug you into this process? Specifically because if 90% of jobs are at law firms and vendors, they are billing their time, and therefore that becomes a profitable human being that can bill their time faster and thus add more financial value to the company or to the law firm. They're looking for that. It's very different in the security and privacy worlds, right? We don't send cybersecurity people on interviews and have them get asked the detailed nuances of how they might use a Cylance technology or a CrowdStrike piece of technology. They're much more interested in the, how do you influence somebody to do things a certain way, or how do you run evaluations on a tabletop-like exercise for where there are potential deficiencies in process or technology, and it's much less tool specific. E-discovery hiring managers tend to drive interview processes with tool specificity, and that's not the same in all these other industries. And it might be one day, as those industries begin to consolidate, right? In privacy, we are seeing more people ask about OneTrust and Big ID, but there is a huge ecosystem of other tools, a lot of which in the corporate sector are built in-house, right? They're man-made for that corporation, as opposed to being licensed from a third party. And so it becomes really critical for an e-discovery professional jumping multiverses to talk not only about what they know, but how they wield what they know and influence others and add value. Robert, any other questions?
Yeah, on this one here, I think this is a really important point. Tool specific. If they're asking for very specific tools, that's because they have a defined process. You have to ask yourself, am I going to be influential there? Is that what I'm looking for? Is that the best place for me to make a lateral? Remember, this whole area of compliance and security and data privacy, it's new. This is like e-discovery back in, the early 2000s. So this is a emerging market. The second thing is open roles. If there's a defined process in an organization, we're talking about, in many instances, back office. So it's no longer part of the profit-making part of the organization. Your value to the organization is how you reduce costs through efficiency. And so in that, you need to be comfortable with that. But also, if there's an open role, it's because they have something specific they need to solve. You need luck. But again, as you're interviewing a company, create that luck for yourself, right? Be open, be clear about what it is that you're looking and where it is that you can help and the problems that you've solved. So use free learning, learn vocabulary, and so that you can take, for instance, cybersecurity. There's a million tools out there for cybersecurity, and even cybersecurity people can't tell you exactly what they do, right? Because they do one thing. So speak more about what is the problem that needs to be solved, making sure that we know who logs on, or making sure that all files of this type are flagged with classification, these type of things, and talk to that and not the tool.
Robert, before we get to our final thoughts, we've got a few questions, and I want to invite everybody that's listening in to ask. Now's the time to ask questions. Here's the first one, Robert, from a dear friend and a talented guy, Mr. Collister. Does your use of the term security mean cybersecurity? And if so, cybersecurity being a specialized discipline and one that is of the utmost importance to an organization, how would a former e-discovery professional's experience leverage them into such a specific and critical role?
Great question. So the first thing, cybersecurity really is a marketing term. Sorry, but it's really easy to go get money from boards of directors and investors saying cybersecurity. But cybersecurity is nothing more than good security practice and governance for managing technology and data. That's all it is. It just happens to be that, there's lots of great stories, right? Most hacks are done internally, not externally. So the answer to the question is a couple of things. Number one, cybersecurity has many facets. So again, if you remove cybersecurity from the conversation and you replace that with technology, in technology, you need to design solutions. That's people, process, technical controls, and data that flows through those processes and controls. You need to manage or implement those processes. So there's roles there. You need to govern those, and then you need to decommission those, and then you need to investigate those. So there's lots of areas in there if you pick a particular type of data or a particular system or a particular area of law or regulation that's really interesting to you, and focus on that. If you have questions one-on-one, ping me. I'm happy to talk about it.
I'd also add to that I think it's really important if you're transitioning specifically from e-discovery to cyber to know what you don't know and be able to talk about what you don't know. Meaning, if there are specific tools that you don't understand, and we give the same advice to people that are looking to break into e-discovery. Hey, the client's going to come in and ask you about your relativity or your iPro expertise or your reveal brain space knowledge. And if you don't have it, you have to be able to talk about what you don't know. So to not know the tools that are industry standard for processing data, or to not know the tools that are industry standard for vulnerability testing, puts you at a disadvantage, right? So being well researched and being able to talk about what you don't know often helps the hiring manager that's interviewing you understand where the gaps are and then evaluate whether or not they're willing to fill those gaps because of all the other value that you add, knowing that you are aware of what you don't know. So it's just as important to talk about what you know, but also be able to talk about what you don't know with confidence. Robert, we've got another question here. This is from Joe Dirty. Is automated resume filtering a major challenge for getting past the front door when an eDiscovery Pro is looking to demonstrate that their eDiscovery skills experience are applicable in that particular job or Spider-Verse? And if so, what are some methods to consider to get a submitted resume past the gatekeeper? Is it potentially necessary to create several resumes with each sector-specific vernacular? Robert, I'll let you take a stab at that first. I have some opinions here too.
I'm not an expert in resumes and current technology. Listen, I personally go put a whole bunch of labels in the hidden metadata field in my Word documents and upload them. So it just hits on everything. But here's from a hiring perspective, I like word of mouth. I like finding talent via conversations, whether I meet you at an event or one of the team members says, hey, I work with this person. They don't know this, but they're really good at this. Right? I am willing to speak to that person. One of my least favorite things is to go through a whole bunch of resumes because 80% of them are like, why are you posting here? And so it's really fatiguing. So I would offer networking, and also working with companies like Jared, and listen, I'm a massive fan of Jared. But working with companies like Jared is a really great way because they will often help you get your resume ready, but also take that first step of getting you in the door.
So Joe, I'll answer your question backwards to forwards because I have some really specific guidance and advice. The first is, yes, you might need different resumes when you're submitting for different jobs, depending on what spectrum of the multiverse you're looking to get into. Why? For two reasons. The first of which is in Q4 of 2022, the economy started to look like it was going to go into recession. And the first thing to get removed were budget for headcount and budget for third-party recruitment agencies like mine. Now we've rebounded. People now have headcount and people are starting to use recruiters the way that they were in 21 and 22, not nearly as much as they were, I can tell you from personal experience. But the same thing that happened in Q4 of 2022 is the explosion of AI. And everybody started using ChatGPT and other forms of AI to do different tasks that they thought were rote. And often when people say we don't have the budget to hire a third-party recruiter, they lean on their managers to go and become recruiters themselves, or they lean on internal human resources. When you get thousands of applicants for a single hire, there's no way for a human being to go through it. Robert just said, I don't want to go through 1,000 resumes by hand. So what do? Well, they're starting to train AI models to cull those resumes. And the people who are building these models are not necessarily the subject matter experts or the hiring managers in charge of managing the people that they will ultimately hire. So you will have people that are using basic keywords or the wrong keywords to filter resumes. And so, yes, you need to think about what is the vernacular, what is the vocabulary in the multiverse I'm looking to move into, and make sure you're translating your experience into that vocabulary so that you can get through the AI, much less the actual hiring manager who can read it and be interpretive with the resume in a way that is substantive and reading for value, not keyword, right? And we're all e-discovery professionals, so we know how to look for documents that are purely keyword hits versus documents that might suggest they could be relevant or privileged documents. And so, go ahead, Robert.
Sorry, if I may, just on here, Joe's question is a good one, but remember, you have a lot of information in front of you already. It's generally the hiring manager or the hiring manager's team that has written the job description. They're using their vocabulary. They're using their systems. So when, to your point, yes, update your resume, update your cover letter, and find a way to send the cover letter if at all possible, and use their vocabulary, use their phrases, look for 3-word tokens, right? And try to weave those into how you solve problems and can help them solve problems. And that will help you get that.
But for the next 6 to 9 months, corporations in particular are combating resource and budget deficiency with the attempt to automate tasks by training new models in AI in an experimental way. And that means you too might have to be experimental with how you articulate your skills and experience on a resume in order to jump multiverses. We're at the end of the hour. I know we could have a few more questions, so we can hang out for a little bit to answer those, but I want to quickly go to final thoughts, Robert, that you want to leave everybody with after today's super cool webinar.
Listen, first of all, for those that joined, and particularly those who stayed on, thank you. Incredibly privileged to be sitting here today speaking about this topic. I'm passionate about this because as I go down this journey now with cybersecurity risk governance, I see the capabilities of my colleagues in ediscovery, and I see where we need that talent. Corporate governance around the world needs that talent. So hopefully a couple of you have been encouraged to at least have that conversation and begin that journey of moving your talents to the thinking about how can we prevent from the we need this now.
I'll close by saying thank you to Robert for joining us. We will make this entire recording available for free to share with your friends or to rewatch yourselves. And I'll say this, Robert is utterly and completely unique in so many ways and truly one of the smartest people I've ever been in a room with. But he is not alone. There are many, many people with similar or divergent backgrounds from his who are making similar leaps with their careers. So please have the courage, don't be afraid, and feel free to come to us at True Staffing Partners for guidance about how to move from different ESI Spider-Verses. Thank you so much for everybody who attended. Tell your friends and join us again for future True Staffing Partners webinars. Have a great end of the month. Thank you, everyone.